Caleb Rourke had barely set one boot on the air stair when the chief executive of Vanderlyn Global Holdings stepped into his path and stopped him cold in front of the entire flight crew. Sloan Vanderlyn looked him over, from the worn leather jacket to the plain canvas bag slung over his shoulder, and told him flatly that he was in the wrong place. She ordered the gate coordinator to strike his name from the manifest before the engines ever turned. Caleb did not argue. He simply looked past her shoulder at the tail number painted on the fuselage, lifted his phone, and said 6 quiet words. 2 minutes later, the captain walked back down the stairs, returned Sloane's luggage to her hands, and informed her the aircraft would still depart, but only with her seated as a guest of Caleb Rourke. If you love a good power reversal that nobody sees coming, hit that subscribe button now, because this flight is about to change who is really in charge before it ever leaves the ground. The morning had begun under a thin gray sleet at Northgate Executive Air, the kind of weather that made every polished surface at the terminal gleam a little colder than usual. A line of black sedans rolled up to the private entrance carrying the leadership of Vanderlyn Global, and the staff moved through their practiced choreography, laying out a runner of carpet, pouring coffee into monogrammed cups, and inspecting Sloane's luggage with the kind of care usually reserved for royalty. She swept through the doors already mid-sentence on a call about the merger closing in New York, her voice sharp enough to cut through the low hum of the lounge. Nobody in that procession noticed the pickup truck pulling into the far end of the lot, its paint faded by years of Colorado winters, until the man driving it stepped out with nothing but a travel bag and a waterproof folder tucked under one arm. Caleb crossed the lot alone. No assistant walked beside him. No driver trailed behind to open doors. No security detail scanned the room the way it did for every other name on that morning's schedule. Before he reached the entrance, his phone buzzed with a call from his 12-year-old daughter, who wanted to make sure he would not miss her recital the following evening. He promised her he would be home in time, tucked the phone away, and pushed through the terminal doors with the unhurried calm of a man who had somewhere to be but no need to rush toward it. At the check-in counter, he handed his identification to a young coordinator named Miles Granger, who glanced at the name on the screen and went still. Years earlier, Caleb had worn a different kind of uniform entirely, one built around discipline rather than image, working as a military aviation engineer long before the word aeronautics ever appeared beside his own name in a corporate filing. He had left that life behind after a family loss pulled him away from long deployments and longer hours, choosing instead to build something quieter, an infrastructure and aviation investment practice that let him stay close to his daughter. While still working in the industry, he understood better than almost anyone. He founded Rourke Aeronautics Trust without fanfare, structuring it deliberately so his name rarely appeared in headlines or industry profiles, since he had learned firsthand what it cost a family to live under constant public scrutiny. Wealth to Caleb had never been something to display, and the plain jacket and the aging pickup truck were not a disguise so much as an honest reflection of a man who measured worth by different instruments than most people in his tax bracket. He understood the mechanics of aircraft the way other executives understood spreadsheets, down to the smallest technical detail, and it was that fluency, paired with a controlling stake in the trust that legally owned the Gulfstream, that made him nearly impossible to dismiss the moment anyone actually checked his credentials. The system flagged Caleb's credentials with the highest priority clearance the terminal software allowed, marking him with unrestricted access, no requirement for lessee approval, and full authority to alter any flight plan associated with the aircraft. Miles read the notation twice, uncertain what to do with information that contradicted everything he assumed about the man standing in front of him in a jacket that looked like it had survived 2 decades of use. Before he could ask a single question, Sloane appeared at the counter, her eyes sweeping over Caleb with the practiced dismissal of someone accustomed to sorting people into categories at a glance. She assumed he was a technician, a courier, or simply lost, and she said so without bothering to lower her voice. Caleb answered simply that he was there for the flight to New York, and Sloane laughed once, short and humorless, informing him that the aircraft was reserved exclusively for senior leadership. He offered his aviation identification to Miles, and Sloane snatched it from the counter before the coordinator could process it. She scanned the unfamiliar name, decided it belonged to some old contractor badge, and handed it back with the flat certainty of someone who had never once been asked to double-check anything in her own domain. Caleb did not correct her. He only asked whether she was certain she had the standing to turn him away, a question that landed harder than she expected and drew a flicker of irritation across her face. Sloane told him plainly that the aircraft belonged to Vanderlyn Global, and that nobody boarded without her personal authorization. And Caleb turned his gaze toward the window where the tail number sat gleaming under the terminal lights, quietly suggesting she might want to check what the word belonged to actually meant. She ordered Miles to remove Caleb's name from the manifest immediately, and the young coordinator's hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen because the system would not let him complete the command, no matter how many times he tried. Sloane assumed it was nothing more than a technical glitch, the kind of software hiccup that occasionally plagued the terminal's outdated booking system, and she accused Caleb of exploiting some loophole in the security protocol to sneak onto a flight he had no business boarding. In front of the assembled executives and the watching flight crew, she demanded he prove he could even afford a seat on a commercial carrier, since clearly this aircraft was beyond his means. Caleb answered that this particular aircraft did not sell tickets, and Sloane's mouth curled into something between a smirk and a warning, telling him that was precisely why he did not belong there, because people who truly had the right to board never needed to argue for it. Graham Lockridge, the company's chief financial officer, stood near the doorway and recognized the surname on Caleb's identification the instant he saw it, though his expression gave nothing away. He had seen the words Rourke Aeronautics Trust buried in financial disclosures before, and a small knot of dread tightened in his stomach at the thought that this man might be here to audit something he desperately did not want examined. Rather than warn Sloane, Graham quietly encouraged her to have security remove Caleb from the boarding area, calculating that the faster this stranger disappeared, the safer his own position remained. Graham had spent the better part of 2 years quietly restructuring portions of the company's asset base, moving pieces around in ways that looked, on the surface, like ordinary financial housekeeping, but that would collapse under any real scrutiny. A man like Caleb, calm, technically fluent, and apparently connected to the very aircraft at the center of several of those disclosures, represented exactly the kind of unpredictable variable Graham had spent years trying to eliminate from his plans. He told himself he was protecting the company by pushing Caleb out the door, though the truth sitting underneath that justification had far more to do with protecting himself. Miles tried once more to explain that the system listed Caleb as the controlling access authority for the aircraft, but Sloane cut him off before he finished the sentence and ordered his own credentials suspended for failing to follow a direct instruction. Caleb asked 3 questions in a row, each delivered with the same unhurried patience. Who held the registered ownership of the aircraft, when the current lease agreement expired, and whether the company had completed its most recent quarterly payment on time. The specificity of the questions drained the color from Graham's face. Though Sloane remained convinced, this was simply a disgruntled former employee who had overheard fragments of information he did not fully understand. She ordered security to escort him out of the boarding area, and Caleb complied without resistance, setting his folder down on a nearby seat and stating he would leave the moment someone produced written confirmation that Vanderlyn Global actually owned the plane. Nobody could produce it. Sloan, furious at being challenged in front of her own leadership team, pulled up her phone and displayed the aircraft's photograph from the company website as though a marketing image settled the matter of legal title. Caleb told her a promotional photograph was not a certificate of ownership, and a few of the pilots standing nearby exchanged a glance that suggested they understood exactly where this was heading. Captain Avery Kincaid stepped forward to speak, but Sloan silenced her before she could get a word out, ordering the cabin door closed the moment the luggage finished loading, and declaring that Caleb was permanently barred from using any asset belonging to Vanderlyn Global. Caleb asked once more if she was certain she wanted that statement entered into the record, and Sloan answered that she wanted the entire terminal to hear it. He lifted his phone, placed a single call, and spoke 6 words to the woman who answered, "Activate Article 14, effective immediately." Caleb remained seated in the terminal lounge. After the call ended, his expression as unreadable as it had been from the moment he arrived, while Sloan instructed her ground team to proceed with pre-departure checks as though nothing had happened. Captain Kincaid received an alert on her tablet moments later, and her posture changed the instant she read it, because the notice stated that Vanderlyn Global's operating authority over the aircraft had been suspended, and that every flight directive now required approval from Rourke Aeronautics Trust. She walked down the air stair and informed Sloan, as gently as the situation allowed, that the flight could not depart under her command. Sloan accused the crew of breaching contract, insisting the company had paid for exclusive use of the aircraft for years without interruption. But Avery explained that Vanderlyn Global had only ever been the lessee, that the flight crew answered to the company designated by the actual owner, and that a suspension of this kind carried immediate legal force. Sloan turned to Graham demanding an explanation, and he offered a vague theory about a payment dispute, something easily resolved with a phone call to accounting. Caleb corrected him without raising his voice, noting that this went well beyond a missed payment, that the aircraft's lease terms had been violated by using the asset as collateral it was never authorized to secure. A video call flashed onto the lounge display, and Lena Whitmore, lead counsel for Rourke Aeronautics Trust, appeared on screen with the calm precision of someone who had reviewed every relevant document a dozen times over. She confirmed that the aircraft belonged to the trust, that Caleb served as its controlling beneficiary and final authority, and that Vanderlyn Global operated under a 7-year lease that could be suspended the moment the asset was used to secure an unauthorized debt. For the first time since she had walked into the terminal that morning, Sloan looked at Caleb with something other than contempt. She asked, almost involuntarily, why a man who owned an aircraft like this one would dress the way he did, and Caleb answered that clothing did not appear anywhere on a federal registration document. A few members of her own leadership team lowered their eyes, embarrassed on her behalf, while Graham attempted to pull Caleb aside for a quiet negotiation, insisting the New York meeting was too important to delay. Caleb asked whether it was important to the company or important to Graham personally, and the question hung in the air a moment too long for comfort. Sloan, still trying to reclaim some measure of authority, argued that even if Caleb technically owned the plane, he had no right to unilaterally cancel a trip the company had already paid to use. Lena read the relevant clause aloud from the lease. Once operating authority is suspended, every subsequent flight is governed entirely by the decision of the owner. Caleb stated that he still intended to fly to New York that morning, and Sloan immediately insisted that she and her leadership team needed to be on that aircraft as well. He looked at her for a long moment, then repeated her own words back to her, that anyone boarding this aircraft required the owner's permission. The terminal fell silent. Rather than banning her outright, Caleb allowed Sloane to fly with him under a short list of conditions. She would board as a passenger. She would have no authority to alter the route. She would issue no instructions to the crew, and all of the company's financial documents on board would be sealed until further notice. Captain Kincaid turned toward Sloane and asked, without a trace of sarcasm, whether she accepted Mr. Rourke's terms in order to board his aircraft. Sloane had no real choice, since the New York meeting would determine the entire future of the merger and, quite possibly, her own position at the head of the company. Before boarding, Avery required her to sign an acknowledgement agreeing to the owner's command, to non-interference with the crew, and to no unauthorized access to the aircraft's technical or document compartments, a humiliation delivered in full view of her own staff. Caleb boarded first, choosing the seat with the fold-out work table so he could review his folder of documents, while Sloane waited for the captain's confirmation before she was allowed up the stairs at all. The seat she normally occupied in the main cabin, the one closest to the galley, had already been claimed, and she found herself settling instead into a chair near the rear, surrounded by details that suddenly felt less like her own territory than they ever had before. The embroidered napkins bearing the Vanderlyn crest, the crystal glassware etched with the family name, the small conference room tucked behind the main cabin, all of it had the sudden hollow feeling of borrowed scenery rather than personal legacy. Caleb told her plainly that the decor was nothing more than furnishings installed by the lessee, and that the aircraft itself, in every legal sense that mattered, still belonged to the Rourke Trust. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Graham quietly sent a message from his seat near the front, and moments later Lena warned Caleb that several files related to the merger were being deleted from the company's servers in real time. Caleb instructed every device belonging to the leadership team to be switched offline for the remainder of the flight, and Sloane objected immediately, insisting he had no authority over company equipment. He replied that he had no interest in controlling the company, only in preventing his own aircraft from becoming an instrument for destroying evidence mid-flight. Sloane asked him directly why he was truly on this plane, and Caleb answered without hesitation. He told her he had been contacted by an independent member of the board who suspected the aircraft had been falsely declared as fully owned company property in order to inflate the collateral behind the merger. If that suspicion proved true, the entire transaction could amount to fraud on a scale large enough to threaten thousands of jobs. Sloane insisted she had never seen any such filing, and Graham interjected that this was simply standard financial structuring, nothing more than routine paperwork. Caleb asked why a leased asset would appear in the fixed asset appendix of a merger disclosure at all, and Graham's answer dissolved into vague, circling language that satisfied no one. Sloane's father, Prescott Vanderlyn, called her phone at that exact moment and instructed her not to answer a single one of Caleb's questions, and the certainty in his voice told Sloane, with a sinking clarity, that her father already knew exactly who Caleb Rourke was. She asked her father why he had never once mentioned that the aircraft did not fully belong to the company, and Prescott answered that image mattered more than legal detail, a response that landed like a small betrayal she had not braced herself for. Caleb did not exploit her moment of doubt. He simply told her she had two paths in front of her: protect the family's reputation, or find out the truth before the board meeting began without her. Before she could respond, Captain Kincaid alerted them to a technical warning showing that the fuel load did not match the flight plan that had been filed before departure, and it became clear that someone had altered the route long before Caleb ever set foot in the terminal that morning. Avery pulled up the navigation system and discovered the original flight plan had been quietly amended, with a technical stop inserted at Bermuda beneath the publicly listed destination of New York. Sloan insisted she had never approved any such stop, and Graham offered a limp explanation about fuel contingency planning that nobody in the cabin found convincing. Avery pointed out that the aircraft carried more than enough fuel to fly directly, and that the added stop had been entered using an authorization code belonging to the office of the chief financial officer. Caleb requested that the cargo hold be inspected, and when Sloan protested that it contained confidential documents, he reminded her that confidentiality did not entitle anyone to turn this aircraft into an unmonitored courier for undeclared assets. The co-pilot conducted the search and found a combination-locked case with no passenger name attached to it anywhere on the manifest. Graham claimed the case held nothing more than duplicate merger paperwork, and Lena, still on the line, advised against opening it mid-flight but insisted it be sealed immediately and preserved as evidence. The lock itself was unusual for a simple paperwork case, a combination mechanism more commonly used to secure sensitive hardware than routine contracts, and Avery noted quietly that its weight did not match what a stack of paper documents should ever weigh. Caleb ran a hand along the seam of the case without attempting to open it, confirming through touch alone that something rigid and electronic sat inside beneath the outer lining. He asked Graham when exactly the case had been loaded onto the aircraft, and Graham's answer shifted twice within the same breath, first claiming it had been packed the previous evening, then insisting it had arrived that same morning with the rest of the executive luggage. Sloan watched the inconsistency land and said nothing, filing it away the way Caleb had been filing away every small contradiction since the moment he boarded. Sloan demanded a real explanation, and Graham admitted, haltingly, that he had used her electronic signature to authorize the change in route, insisting he had simply needed to meet an overseas investor before the New York session began. Caleb asked for the investor's name, and Graham refused to give it, prompting Lena to run a search of her own from the ground. What she found tied the supposed investor directly back to a private holding entity connected to the Lockridge family, and the outline of a scheme began to take shape in front of everyone in the cabin. Graham intended to quietly transfer a portion of ownership in one of the company's major energy projects into that overseas entity, a transfer that would become nearly impossible to trace once the merger closed, and the aircraft itself had been repurposed as a vehicle for moving original documents and signing hardware out of reach of anyone watching too closely. Sloane's anger sharpened into something colder as she realized her own name and reputation had been used as cover for the entire scheme, and Caleb reminded her that a culture built on unquestioned authority was exactly what had allowed Graham to operate without a single person daring to challenge him. She thought back, unwillingly, to the number of times a junior analyst or a mid-level manager had hesitated before delivering bad news to her, softening figures or burying concerns beneath layers of cautious language, and she understood now, with uncomfortable clarity, that she had trained her own organization to fear her rather than to trust her with the truth. It was a small, private reckoning, one that had nothing to do with Graham's fraud directly, yet everything to do with why it had gone unnoticed for as long as it had. Sloan fired back that Caleb was doing the very same thing, using his ownership of the aircraft to control everyone on it, and Caleb accepted the comparison without flinching, pointing out the one distinction that mattered most: power that came with accountability, power that welcomed scrutiny rather than hiding from it. He instructed Avery to continue directly toward New York, but Graham quietly attempted to reroute the aircraft again through the satellite communication system, sending a falsified command under Sloane's own name. Sloan confirmed on the spot, in front of the entire cabin, that she had sent no such order, and it marked the first moment she had publicly aligned herself with Caleb rather than against him. Graham's access to the communication system was revoked before he could try again, and as his equipment was collected, He warned that the New York meeting would mean nothing anyway, since the board had already begun preparing to remove Sloan from her position entirely. Sloan did not fully trust Graham's warning, but she understood the board's frustration was real, and a quick check of her calendar revealed the meeting invitation had been quietly moved up by 2 full hours from what she had originally been told. Had the aircraft actually diverted through Bermuda, she would have missed the vote entirely, a convenient absence that would have let the merger proceed unchallenged under an interim finance chief. It became painfully clear that her father may have known about the plan, perhaps even approved of it, convinced that his daughter lacked the toughness needed to steer the company through this crisis. Sitting in the cabin, Sloan finally admitted to herself that Prescott had never truly handed her the reins of anything, and that the aircraft she once treated as proof of her own authority had only ever been a prop meant to make her feel like she was in control. Caleb told her flatly that he had not come to save her position, only to protect the asset in front of him and to stop a transaction that stood to hurt thousands of employees who had nothing to do with any of this. Sloan asked him directly what it would take for him to help her reach that meeting in time, and Caleb laid out 3 conditions without hesitation: full access to every piece of merger data, an immediate suspension of Graham the moment they landed, and a public disclosure to the board about who truly owned the aircraft she had spent years treating as her own. She struggled with that final condition, knowing it would strip away a piece of the family's carefully built image, and Caleb told her that a reputation built on an asset that was never truly hers was not a reputation at all, only a costume. She agreed to the first 2 conditions immediately, still hesitating on the third, and Caleb did not push her further, telling her that whatever she chose to do in that boardroom would reveal whether she was any different from her father. Graham made one last attempt to convince her that Caleb was maneuvering to seize control of the company outright, and Caleb calmly revealed he held no equity in Vanderlyn Global whatsoever, though his trust did hold roughly $480 million in secured bonds tied to the company's obligations. If the fraudulent merger went through as planned, the entire company risked default, and Sloan finally understood exactly why Caleb had shown up that morning. Not to take over her company, but to stop its assets from being quietly stripped away before the creditors ever noticed. Her father called once more as the aircraft began its descent, ordering her to have the pilots divert the flight regardless of what Caleb wanted, and for the first time in her life, Sloan told him plainly that he no longer had the authority to give commands aboard this particular aircraft. Prescott snapped back that the plane carried the family name, and Sloan looked across the cabin at Caleb before answering that it only carried their logo, nothing more. Lena's voice came through the cabin speaker moments later, informing them that the board had already begun its vote without Sloan present, and the descent toward New York suddenly felt like a race against a clock that had been set to run out before she ever landed. The aircraft touched down at Teterboro, and Prescott had arranged a private car waiting for Graham alone, leaving Sloan to realize just how thoroughly the plan to remove her had already been set into motion. Caleb offered the use of a vehicle belonging to Rourke Aeronautics Trust instead, and when Sloan instinctively moved toward the back seat out of old habit, he told her there was no time left for formality of any kind. The 2 of them reviewed the documents together during the drive into Manhattan, working through everything Lena had compiled: the falsified asset records, the hidden Bermuda routing, the forged electronic authorization, and the paper trail connecting the transferred assets back to Graham's family holdings. Sloan faced a choice she had never had to make before, whether to use this evidence purely to protect her own seat at the head of the table or to admit that the entire governance structure beneath her had been broken from the start. When they arrived at the Vanderlyn headquarters, the security guard at the entrance had been instructed to deny Caleb access entirely. Sloane experienced, in that exact moment, the mirror image of what she had done to Caleb back at the terminal that morning, and the guard informed them flatly that his name did not appear anywhere on the approved visitor list. She could have walked in alone and let the moment pass, but instead she insisted Caleb be admitted as the company's primary bondholder and as a first-hand witness to what had happened aboard the flight. The guard called upstairs for approval, and Prescott personally refused the request, forcing Caleb to place a second call, this time to the bank overseeing the trust's secured bonds. He invoked his contractual right to demand an emergency creditor, meeting the moment evidence of a collateral violation surfaced, and the board meeting in progress was forced to pause entirely while the request was addressed. Caleb was granted entry moments later, not because Sloane pleaded on his behalf, but because his legal standing left the board no real choice but to listen. Inside the boardroom, Prescott announced that his daughter had lost control of the company, and Graham accused her of allowing an outsider to seize command of a corporate aircraft that belonged to Vanderlyn Global. Sloane rose to her feet and told the room, without flinching, that the aircraft had never truly belonged to the company at all. The room dissolved into overlapping voices and disbelief, and she pressed on anyway, admitting that the family had built its image on a falsehood, that the asset reports contained deliberate inaccuracies, and that she herself had never once verified the truth, because she had trusted her position too completely to question it. Prescott stared at his daughter, as though she had betrayed the family itself, and Sloane answered that staying silent would have been the real betrayal, not just of the family, but of everyone who worked for the company she was supposed to protect. Several board members who had sat through countless meetings without ever questioning the Vanderlyn name exchanged uneasy glances, some of them recalculating, in real time, how many of their own assumptions about the company had rested on nothing more than inherited trust. One senior director asked bluntly whether the falsified records extended beyond the aircraft, and Sloane, rather than deflecting, admitted she genuinely did not know the full scope yet and would not pretend otherwise in front of people who deserved an honest answer. Another director pointed out that this admission alone, delivered without spin or evasion, was the first fully transparent statement anyone in Vanderlyn leadership had offered in longer than she cared to remember. Graham tried to interject, insisting the discrepancies were minor and easily corrected before any regulator ever noticed, but his voice had lost the smooth authority it carried only hours earlier, and nobody in the room seemed inclined to extend him the benefit of the doubt any longer. Caleb set the sealed case down on the conference table and told the room quietly that whatever it contained would likely decide who walked out of that meeting, still holding the title of chief executive, and who walked out facing a formal investigation instead. The case was opened in front of an independent attorney, revealing a signed asset transfer agreement, a signing device carrying Sloane's electronic credentials, and paperwork authorizing Graham to alter voting rights once the merger closed. Graham insisted Sloane had known about the arrangement all along, and she denied it with absolute certainty, a claim that held up once a review of the system logs showed her signature had been generated at a time when she was attending a public company event nowhere near the device in question. Graham had used a backup access key that Prescott himself had authorized months earlier, and under direct questioning, Prescott admitted he had granted that access because he wanted the merger completed at any cost, believing that protecting the family's standing mattered more than following proper procedure. Caleb pointed out plainly that had the plan succeeded, thousands of employees and small shareholders would have been left to absorb the resulting debt, while Graham and select members of the family quietly moved assets beyond reach. The board voted to suspend Graham on the spot, and the full file was handed over to financial investigators for formal review, while Prescott was stripped of his advisory role within the hour. The room had grown quieter by then. The earlier hostility softened into something more like careful reassessment, as board members who had spent years deferring automatically to the Vanderlyn name began, for the first time, weighing Sloane's words on their own merit rather than on the strength of her surname. Sloane still had to face a vote of no confidence, since several board members argued she had failed to provide adequate oversight and had allowed a culture of fear to take root beneath her. Caleb did not defend her without qualification. He told the board plainly that being deceived by her own father did not erase her personal responsibility, reminding them that she had humiliated him publicly that very morning, that she had routinely used her position to silence employees who dared to question her, and that this exact culture was precisely why someone like Miles had been too afraid to speak up when it mattered most. Sloane accepted every word of it without argument, and rather than fighting to preserve her title at any cost, she proposed a set of concrete changes: independent financial oversight, a full public correction of the company's records, the surrender of her exclusive personal use of the aircraft, and a real whistleblower protection program built to give employees like Miles an actual voice. The board did not remove her that day, but placed her under a 6-month period of review, and Caleb agreed not to trigger the trust's default clause immediately, provided the promised reforms were carried out in good faith. After the meeting ended, Sloane asked Caleb whether he had known from the very start that she would end up needing his permission just to board her own company's aircraft, and Caleb told her he had only known she would eventually have to face the truth, and that becoming a passenger on her own plane was a consequence built entirely by the way she had treated the people around her. The weeks that followed the board meeting proved harder than the meeting itself, since restoring trust with employees, regulators, and shareholders took far longer than a single afternoon of honesty ever could. Sloane spent long stretches of those weeks in rooms far smaller than any boardroom, sitting across from line employees who had spent years too afraid to raise concerns about anything, listening to accounts of dismissed complaints and ignored warnings that stretched back further than she wanted to admit. Some of those conversations were uncomfortable in ways she had never allowed herself to experience before, since apologizing to a stranger for a culture she had helped maintain required a different kind of courage than winning a boardroom argument. Caleb stayed largely out of the process once the immediate crisis passed, checking in only through Lena's periodic updates, content to let Sloane either rebuild the company honestly or fail to on her own. 3 months later, Vanderlyn Global issued a full restatement of its financial reports, and while the stock price dropped in the aftermath, the company avoided total collapse and its major infrastructure projects remained intact. Graham faced formal charges connected to fraud and forged authorization, while Prescott was removed from the board permanently and lost all access to internal systems. Miles Granger, once threatened with dismissal for simply following protocol, was invited to join the company's internal reform committee, where he helped design a new verification process for tracking corporate assets. He approached the work with a quiet thoroughness nobody at his old desk had ever noticed in him, cross-referencing every leased asset against its actual title documentation and flagging discrepancies that had sat untouched in company files for years. Colleagues who once walked past his desk without a glance began stopping to ask his opinion on matters well outside his original job description, and within a few months he had become the person other employees quietly sought out whenever something did not add up. Sloane made a point of thanking him personally, not with a public announcement or a plaque, but with a private conversation in which she admitted that his hesitation at the terminal that morning had been the first thread in the entire unraveling, and that the company owed him more than it could ever fully repay. Sloan no longer treated the aircraft as a personal symbol of status, choosing instead to fly on aircraft chartered strictly according to need. And she began presenting every travel expense directly to the board rather than assuming her position excused her from scrutiny. She also started meeting face-to-face with lower-level staff instead of relying solely on filtered reports from senior management, a habit that slowly began to change the tone of the entire organization. Caleb retained full ownership of the Gulfstream, and under a new lease agreement, Vanderlyn Global was permitted to use it again, though the terms had changed completely. Every flight had to serve a legitimate business purpose. The chief executive no longer held authority to bar anyone with approved access, and the flight crew now answered independently rather than to company leadership. On the first flight under this new arrangement, Sloan encountered Caleb again at the terminal, and this time she checked the passenger list herself instead of issuing orders to whoever happened to be standing nearby. When she saw his name confirmed on the manifest, she asked which seat he preferred, and Caleb chose one near the window without ceremony. She asked whether she was permitted to use the small conference room toward the rear of the cabin, and Caleb told her that since she was the one leading the business trip that day, the room was hers to use, not because the aircraft belonged to her, but because her right to use it had finally been clearly defined. Before they boarded, Sloan offered him an apology, not for once insulting a wealthy man, but for having treated a fellow human being as though his clothing determined whether he deserved basic respect. Caleb accepted the apology, though he reminded her that real change was proven through habit over time, not through a single sentence spoken once. Sloan nodded and waited quietly for the crew to invite the two of them aboard, and this time, she did not walk up the stairs ahead of everyone else the way she once had. He told her, without any bitterness in his voice, that the terminal where they now stood had not changed at all since that first morning. The same carpet, the same coffee, the same practiced routines running quietly in the background, and that the only real difference this time was the way she carried herself through it. Sloan admitted that she thought about that first morning often, not out of shame exactly, but as a kind of measuring stick, a reminder of the version of herself she no longer wanted to be. Caleb said that kind of memory, the uncomfortable kind a person chooses to keep rather than bury, was usually a better teacher than any leadership seminar the company could ever pay for. A year later, the Gulfstream still carried its original tail number, though the Vanderlyn crest had long since been removed from its fuselage. Inside the cabin door, only a small plaque remained, reading that the right to use something is never the same as the right to own it. Sloan kept her position as chief executive after completing the reforms the board demanded of her, while Caleb continued to avoid public attention, appearing rarely and speaking even less about what had happened that winter morning. Whenever the two of them flew together after that, she made a habit of checking with the crew before altering any part of the itinerary. Caleb never once brought up the day she had barred him from boarding his own aircraft. He never needed to. The quiet way she waited to be invited aboard said everything that words never could.
Do I do it here? No. How do I switch it to the baby head, guys? Oh, right here. What am I doing? All right, you ready? Let's go fight. Let's go fight. All right, which way do we go? So, where do I go from here? Up here? This way? No. We'll figure it out. Which way do I go around? Go back this way? Can you let me know? And go back down this way? Should I go the other way? Yeah, I think I'm regressing. Can you go that way? So it must be go up straight. Alright, we got it. Throw me in another boss battle, bro.